Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram, can't be here today, but instead, we are speaking with Professor or Dr. Joseph P. Laycock, who is an associate professor of religious studies at Texas State University. He specializes in new religious movements, American religious history, and the intersection of religion and popular culture. He's known for his thought-provoking work on unconventional religious groups, and has written extensively on topics like the Satanic Temple, exorcism, and the influence of horror on religious beliefs. And we're just so glad to have him here with us today. So welcome to the show, Professor.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
So I gotta ask, like, you are the second professor we've ever spoken to that works in kind of this abstract sort of belief. Like, I don't even know how, I'm probably not going to do it justice describing it, but like the other person we spoke to was like a professor of the supernatural, and what it is that you're doing is kind of tied. So like, how does one wake up one day and decide, you know what, like I really want to study exorcisms?
Yeah. Well, it kind of happened by accident. It's kind of a case of one thing leads to another. But when I was doing my PhD at Boston University, I took a class on American religious history, and the professor assigned The Exorcist. And he said, obviously, this is a work of fiction. This is not American history, but this is an interesting window into sort of where the American mind was in 1971. This says a lot about how society was changing very rapidly and how they were anxious about that. And if you actually read the novel, you know, there's all this stuff in there about the actress, Chris, the mom. She's using the Ouija board to access her higher self so she can be a better actress. And it's talking about the arrival of Soka Gakkai Buddhism and seeing people chant for the first time and being very worried about that. So one of the first things I ever published was an article about kind of the stuff that went into creating The Exorcist. And then I was asked to edit an encyclopedia of spirit possession around the world, which is a great way to learn a lot about a topic, is to edit an encyclopedia about it. And then when I got hired here at Texas State, we were trying to create a new religious studies major. And they said, come up with a class that will be really exciting and get students to take a religious studies class. So I said, well, I just edited this encyclopedia about exorcism, so we'll do an exorcism class. And then word about that got out, and I did the Art Bell show, Coast to Coast AM, which goes from like midnight to 4 in the morning, and then I got asked to do more books about exorcism. So it feels a little bit like the exorcism chose me instead of the other way around.
Isn't that how it always works though? Like, I don't know anything about exorcism, but isn't it like the evil one finds like their perfect host to wreak havoc upon the world, and maybe you were the chosen vessel.
That's right.
Yeah. So I mean, like, so when it comes to exorcisms, are exorcisms real? Like, is that like a real thing? You know, that priests and others like will I don't know, cast out demons out of folks, or is it really just like a thing of fiction?
I mean, the ritual is absolutely real, right? As if you think demons are real, that's kind of a matter of personal belief, but the ritual is very much real. The Exorcist is accurate in that in 1971, when that novel came out, if you went to a Catholic priest and said, I need an exorcism, they would absolutely say, no, you need mental health. We don't do that. I don't know how to do that. But since that movie came out, all these people began demanding exorcisms, and the Pentecostals and the evangelicals stepped up, and they said, hey, we're always here. If the Catholic Church won't cast your demons out, we can do it. And so there was kind of market competition. So the Catholic Church flipped basically a 180 and said, wow, if you guys like exorcisms, we thought it was embarrassing and you thought we were superstitious, but if you like it, we can do that again. So now there are more exorcisms going on in the Western world than I think at any point since probably the 1600s. And the Diocese of Washington, D.C. even made a phone app. So if you think you need an exorcism, you can put your symptoms or whatever into the phone app, and it'll get reviewed by someone, and they'll tell you if you need an exorcism or not. So it's quite real.
Oh my, wait. Oh, okay. You're gonna have to back up a little bit because it's like you just said something that really like is probably just common knowledge for you, but totally just blew my mind. You said that before the movie, The Exorcism, the book, what have you, there wasn't really like I don't know, a proliferation of exorcisms that were happening around the globe.
But before 1973, when that movie came out in the United States, there are two Catholic exorcisms that we know about. Two, right? Now, when the Catholic Church does an exorcism, they generally try to keep it a secret, if for no other reason, because it's very embarrassing. You don't want people to know that you underwent an exorcism, right? So we only know if it leaks. So there are probably more than two, but that's it, right? And now I feel like we have reports of exorcisms going on all the time, right? And I mean, one factor is because now you can get movie rights, right? So they just came out with a movie based on an exorcism that happened in Gary, Indiana, in I believe 2012. But yeah, it's flipped from being something that's kind of legendary and almost never ever actually happens to being almost boring, and it happens every week.
Oh my gosh, that's so. And I'd love to kind of just sort of stick on that just for a little bit because I know that you've written um, kind of about this, how like religion and or maybe movies, pop culture can influence religions. Can you maybe like unpack that a little bit and maybe, I don't know, give a bit of a diagnosis of like why or how is that even possible?
Yeah, so I want to be really clear that people understand the difference between movies and real life, right? They know movies are just pretend and it's actors and things like that. But movies give your brain a model of what is possible, right? Or they give you a model of something that could happen, right? And so when you're out there in the world and you're trying to sort of make sense of it, your brain is pulling up all these different models that you've seen in other places, right? So if you hear a weird sound, your brain has like a finite number of ideas about what that could be and what an appropriate response would be and so on. So The Exorcist kind of put in people's heads stuff like this could happen, right? And it's based on a true story, right? And then in 1991, Cardinal O'Connor, the Cardinal of New York, gave a sermon in St. Patrick's Cathedral where he actually read from The Exorcist in church and said, "This is gruesomely realistic. And we did two exorcisms in this diocese this month, and they were just like this." So people are like, "Okay, well, it's basically real, right? It's basically stuff like that really does happen, right?" And then after The Exorcist, you got the Omen, which is kind of more aimed at Protestants. The Exorcist is more aimed at Catholics. And in that movie, they just straight up make up Bible verses. You know, they just make up Bible verses that aren't real, but so many people, even professed Christians, are pretty unfamiliar with the Bible. They don't really know anything about it, so they just assumed that must be real. And in the end of that movie, this guy looks at the kid's under his hair, and he finds he has a birthmark that says 666. And so ever since then, people have been kind of preoccupied with things like, oh, Monster Energy drink. The claw marks look kind of like Hebrew letters that spell out 666 and things like this. If you read the book of Revelation, it's pretty clear. It says, calculate the number, count the number. And it's very clear that it's referring to the Emperor Nero, which in Gematria, which would have been the Jewish numerology at the time, spells out 666. That's what it was. But now we're looking at soda cans and things like that. And I think that's mostly because of horror movies.
Wow. That I mean, like if we were to stop the interview right now, I would have a lot to contemplate. We're only 10 minutes in and I still have a ton of questions. So I'm like I'm gonna have to sort of pace myself on the things that I'm ready to actually like, I don't know, come to terms with. So like why why do you think and if you don't know that's fine. This wasn't one of the questions I sent ahead, but it's a question that is coming to mind. Like why are people sort of attracted to these types of movies? I mean, I used to watch horror movies all the time. I've just kind of grown out of it. It's not really my thing anymore. But like for a while, this is before like I started going to church. I used to watch them all the time. I kind of enjoyed being scared, but I don't necessarily envision a lot of believers, necessarily going out and watching The Omen or The Nun or whatever, like, and then crafting some sort of like hermeneutics or theology based around sort of the depiction. So like how, like, help me kind of better understand, like, how does what we see in the movies actually make its way into kind of the pews or, or the lectern?
Yeah, I mean, we should be clear. There's lots of different varieties of horror movies, right? So I love supernatural horror movies. I don't really care for, Saw or like torture porn or slasher or other kinds of genres like that. With the kinds of movies that we're talking about dealing with religious themes, I do think that there is kind of a longing for transcendence or the experience of something supernatural, right? Even if it's scary. And William Peter Blatty, who wrote The Exorcist, when he was told that an exorcism had been performed, and he heard about this when he was at Georgetown University, and the Jesuits who run that university also performed this exorcism on this boy in Maryland. He said, "Man, I hope it's true. I hope that kid was really possessed by the devil, because if he was, then if there's a devil, then there's a God, and if there's a God, then I haven't been wasting every Sunday morning, going to church." There's a great book by a pastor named Peter Laws called The Frighteners, and he talks about I was a smug atheist kid, and it was actually The Exorcist that put the idea in my brain that maybe there's something more out there. So I think that's part of it. There are philosophical writings on why people watch horror movies at all. Like, are these people just sick, who want to see terrible things happen to the actors? And I think the best explanation for that, especially if we're talking about supernatural horror movies, is the intellectual pleasure of a horror movie is not from watching the pain and suffering of others, but it's the desire of figuring out what's going on, right? I just watched Heretic, which is about these two female Mormon missionaries who end up in this really weird guy's house. And that's the enjoyment of this, is what's this guy's deal? Why is he doing this to these girls? Where is this all gonna end up, right? So I think it's possible for very healthy people to enjoy horror movies simply because they're kind of smart and they like to figure things out.
I think the thing that's probably the most I don't know, concerning, I'm not sure if that's really quite the word I want to use, but um is how pop culture horror movies can affect religion, theology, what have you, much in the same way religion can actually affect politics. So we just interviewed Samuel Perry. He's like a leading expert on conservatism, American politics, like Christian nationalism, what have you. In our interview, he mentioned how how on a survey he conducted before the election of Joe Biden, I think this was pre-2020 election, he asked a group of evangelicals, essentially like what's God's involvement in picking the president, and overwhelming across the board, evangelicals said, yeah, God is in charge of picking the president. He did the same survey like after Biden won, and the number was essentially cut in half. And he reasoned that it's because like politics are sort of affecting our theology in ways that we just really don't quite appreciate. And religion is also kind of affecting politics because it's sort of the driving force to enact some of these like measures that are definitely challenging the establishment clause and whatnot. So I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on do these sort of like grand religious events like exorcisms show itself in other sort of facets of society outside of religion? Like is there a tie to its effect on how our politicians think about certain issues or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, now that exorcism is popular once again, it has 100% become a political weapon, right? So, what the church says is this is very private. This is a healing ministry. This is about helping, members of our church with a problem that they're having. But the problem is that they keep doing these public exorcisms, right? Where they're not exorcising a person, but they're exorcising an idea. And this began actually, the first case like this that I'm aware of happened when I believe it was the state of Illinois legalized gay marriage. And this bishop came out and said, I am exorcising the fact that gay marriage is legal. I'm casting it away, right? And of course, that doesn't have any legal repercussions. It's still legal to be gay married, despite what this ritual that was performed. But what that does is it signals to everyone, this is not just a political issue. This is not an ideology I disagree with. This is the presence of supernatural evil, right? And if you can say it's supernatural evil, if you can make that stick, then you don't have to get into arguing about why one policy is better than another or who benefits. Or it's just evil with a capital E, right? So since then, I have seen exorcisms to banish abortion. There was an exorcism in 2020 to banish the fact that Joe Biden is president. you know, that one, the priest who performed that actually did get in trouble with his bishop, because there was still a line where he just sort of
Really?
got on Zoom and said, "I'm banishing the fact that Joe Biden is president." But it really has shifted from being what the church says it is, which is a healing ministry, to being a way of politically sort of signaling what is evil with a capital E and what isn't.
Interesting. So, switching gears here, you've written about the Satanic Temple, and we were fortunate enough to have Lucian Greaves on our show. Real nice guy. Actually, my co-host, who's a pastor, sort of like joked with me, because at the very end of the interview, I said, "Hey, best of luck with what it is you're doing." And he's like, "I can't believe you said that." And I was like, "Well, I do wish him best of luck, like he's got a thing he's doing, and I wish him success, and coming from a pastor, like I wasn't surprised, and I wasn't offended or anything, but I'd love to kind of just get your thoughts about the Satanic Temple, and like, I know you wrote a book about it, help us understand how they're actually changing the way we talk about religion.
Yeah, so for me, what's so interesting about the Satanic Temple is not really that they're Satanists, but that they are sort of, by doing these provocations, by filing these lawsuits, they're kind of cornering people into answering questions that they didn't want to answer, right? So one of them is, what actually is a religion, right? So I have a whole class called "What is Religion?" and I think most people just assume, well, it's what you believe about God, and therefore, if you're an atheist like the Satanic Temple, then you can't be a religion. Nothing in American law says that. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court case U.S. v. Seeger is pretty clear that you don't have to believe in a supreme being to be categorized as a religion. And of course, the IRS has categorized them as a religion. There are other ways of defining what counts as a religion, and the Satanic Temple has sort of forced people to be a bit more thoughtful about that. And one point that Lucian Greaves has made is, so you're saying if I actually worship the devil, I would have more rights than if I use the devil symbolically to talk about my deeply held values? That can't be how it's supposed to work. That can't be what the founding fathers intended. The other thing that they're doing is they're forcing people to think about, what does religious freedom and religious pluralism actually look like? And conservative Christians often said, we love religious freedom. Religious freedom is great. If you don't like us, you hate religious freedom. And the Satanic Temple actually cornered a lot of them into saying, I don't like religious freedom. Religious freedom is bad if it means that the Satanists can go out and do these things or just be Satanists in public. And what that says to me is, well, you never really believed in religious freedom at all. You only believed in privilege for yourself. And the Satanists were the ones who basically proved that. And I find this biblically significant because in the book of Job, that is Satan's job. His job is to test you and see if you actually believe in what you profess, or if you're just paying lip service because you like reaping the blessings from it. Job passes that test, but I think a lot of conservative Christians who've been tested by the Satanic Temple have failed. and they've admitted, actually, yeah, I hate freedom, and I think only people who believe what I believe should have any rights in this country.
Yeah, and that was definitely the focus I was getting when I spoke to Lucian, that we all talk about religious liberty kind of through a Protestant Christian lens. Most of the folks that we've either had on the show and or folks just within our friend circle, when they think of religious liberty, they don't think about Muslims or Hindu or Mormons or insert whatever faith belief. They always just think of, well, like Christians should have religious liberty, the rest should just be oppressed and put underneath a rock or something like that and never to be heard from again. So I think you're right. I think that they are really testing the system, whether intentionally or just sort of by accident. But I like, in your research, has there ever been sort of another similar group like the Satanic Temple that has really kind of pushed the boundaries? Like for me, the first thing I think of is like the Pastafarians. I can't remember the name. I'm ordained by them, actually. Like the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. That's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster I see is doing something somewhat similar, but also very, very different, right? Because they don't believe the universe was created by a flying spaghetti monster, right? They just, I mean, you can't see beliefs, but I'm pretty confident they do not actually believe the things that they say that they believe. When the Satanic Temple shows you the 7 tenets, you can bet they actually believe all those things, right? They're very, very sincere about that, right? But they are both provocations. I think there's kind of slightly different provocations. So the Satanic Temple is asking, why can't we be a religion? And do you actually believe in religious freedom enough that you would tolerate the presence of Satanists? I think what the Pastafarians were doing is they were kind of saying, why are ideas like creationism so privileged that you're willing to have half of the science curriculum be dedicated to creationism instead of evolution? If it's out of respect to a so-called religion, well, then we can play that game too, right? So I feel like they're both trying to make a point, and Malcolm Jerry, one of the founders of the Satanic Temple, said that I have a lot of respect for the Pastafarians, but he also said we're not a parody in the way that the Pastafarians are. We say what we actually believe, and they're kind of being a bit more playful to make a point.
I guess, like, why Satanism, or why the Satanic Temple? Is it primarily because, like, that's just a known figure, sort of a patriarch? I don't know what you would call it. Just a symbol that everybody would instantly recognize and would be controversial, or is there sort of like a deeper reason that they're using Satan as kind of their figurehead?
Yeah, I think some people assume that they just went with Satan because that was what was going to be most upsetting to the Christians, right? And I actually talked to one of their lawyers who even said, guys, could you call yourselves the Free Thinkers Club or something like that? You're making my job way harder calling yourselves the Satanic Temple. People like Lucian Greaves, though. Lucian Greaves has identified as a Satanist since high school. And most of the members of TST that I've met really consider themselves to be Satanists. That's sort of how they identify, and did before they became involved with the Satanic Temple. And the Satanic Temple congregations that I've interviewed have said, we don't let people join our conversation, or our congregation rather, if they're not really Satanists, right? So they'll interview people, and people will be like, this is so hilarious, I can't wait to troll these Christians. And they'll say, so how will you feel doing satanic rituals with us as your congregation? And they're like, wait, you guys are serious? You're really Satanists, right? So why would anyone really be a Satanist? Well, one thing that's important to understand is they are taking their idea of Satan not from the Bible, where Satan is the enemy of humanity, at least in the New Testament, but from the Romantic poets. So people like Lord Byron and Shelley and Victor Hugo and so forth. There's a school of poetry called Romantic Satanism. And these writers looked at Satan and said, here is someone who thinks that they're right and doesn't care that their enemy is infinitely more powerful than them. They're not going to give up because they're right. And there's something actually kind of inspiring and romantic about that. And so they kind of reformed Satan into being this figure who stands up to bullies. And they were using this as a metaphor to kind of critique the monarchy, to critique the authority of the church, and so forth. And so that's what inspires groups like TST. And for them, Satan is like their favorite fictional character, right? So it's kind of like, you could be inspired by Batman, right? And say, you know what, I'm not going to skip leg day because that's not what Batman would do, and still understand that it's a fictional character.
Never skip leg day. I am curious. Like, you brought up, the version of Satan as presented in the Bible. Like, is Satan solely just a byproduct of a Bible story, or does Satan exist elsewhere, kind of in modern history or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. So if you read the Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament, Satan's almost totally absent, right? If you read Genesis 3, it says the snake was the cleverest of all the wild animals. So it's pretty clear it's an animal and it can talk because it's really smart. It doesn't say Satan turned into a snake or anything like that, right? So when Satan shows up, it's hardly ever. He shows up in Job, but in Job, he's hanging out in heaven with God. He's one of God's angels. He's not the enemy of God. He's an enemy of humans. He doesn't like humans very much. Something happens between when the Old Testament and the New Testament are written. So in the Old Testament, God is really powerful, and that's all that really matters. So he's responsible for all the evil in the world. That's God. When you say, well, God's not just powerful, he's loving, well, now you've got a problem, right? Now, how are you going to explain all the evil in the world? So some people think that during this missing period, Judaism was influenced by Zoroastrianism, which is a very ancient religion from Persia, which postulates there is basically two gods. There's a god of good and a god of evil that affect the universe. And so they take Satan from the Hebrew Bible, who doesn't like humans, and then they go to Genesis 6, and in Genesis 6 you have these sons of God who take human wives, and God really doesn't like angels hooking up with humans, so he sends the flood and kills everybody. So you say we've got angels who can rebel against God, and we've got angels who are loyal to God but they don't like people, and you put them together, and now you have Satan who doesn't like God or people, and that's responsible for all the evil in the world. And so in the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles are casting out demons left and right. And what this would have meant in first century Palestine is the world's really dark. It's being ruled by Satan, but now we have a Messiah, right? So this is a sign that this is all about to end. So really ever since, Christianity has been pretty preoccupied with the demonic, right? And there was a little bit of a respite after the Enlightenment. There was a move to say, well, maybe demons aren't real, and maybe these are metaphors for mental illness or something like that. And I feel like now we're kind of getting back to formula of Christianity is about spiritual warfare against, invisible demons that are all around us.
Yeah. So you said Jesus cast out, demons in the New Testament, and I am. I'm not like nearly as fluent in Christianese as my co-host is, but I've read it. I consider myself a Christian, so I'm familiar with the stories. But like you said, cast out. You didn't say exercise. So like I think that this probably just reinforces what you're stating earlier, that exorcism kind of as a verb, or like an experience is not necessarily something that's rooted in Bible times. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, when Jesus and the apostles cast out demons in the Gospels, there's no ritual. They just say, "Get out of here," right? Or Jesus just says, "Get out of here," and the apostles say, "Get out of here," because Jesus said you have to get out of here, and that's it, right? And so by the time Christianity has moved into Europe and it's the Middle Ages, if you thought that you were dealing with demonic possession, which, by the way, in the Middle Ages that could mean something like, "I have a stomach ache. I think it's a demon," right? there was all kinds of stuff that people were doing. So you might not even go to a priest. You might go to like the village wise woman, right? And she might say, I'm gonna smear some oil on you, or I'm gonna say some Hail Marys, or whatever. It was people were kind of making it up as it went along, right? And then the Protestant Reformation happens, and the Protestants said, you Catholics are doing all this nonsense that's not in the Bible. It's basically just magic. You guys are just magicians. And the Catholic Church said, you know what, you're kind of right. You're kind of right. So they wrote the Ritual Romanum, and the Ritual Romanum was published in 1614, and that's the official rituals of all the Catholic Church, including exorcism. And it says exorcism can only be done by a priest. It can only be done using this exact ritual, and it can only be done with the approval of a bishop. So you can't go to the village wise woman anymore if you think you have a demon. And so exorcism came to be associated with this Catholic ritual. But then it turns out that the Protestants, they want to cast out demons too. And so they still do, but they call it deliverance ministry, right? And so they also end up kind of beginning to make up more and more sort of rituals. So if you go to a church that's really into deliverance ministry, I've seen videos of a church where they give everybody a KFC bucket, and they say, as the demons come out of you, spit into this bucket, right? That's not in the Bible either, right? So we're kind of constantly reinventing the wheel and making up new rituals.
I notice. I think as you're talking, you just have this glow, like emanating behind you. I'm like, what's happening here? Like, do we have to exercise the sunlight out of your office? But no, that sounds right, because I don't know if you're familiar with the Chosen TV series. Like there was a scene where like Mary was possessed by demon, and if I'm recalling this scene right, where like Jesus walks in where she's at and does just that, like, yeah, skedaddle, like get out of here, and then like she's fine. Like Jesus didn't like wave a wand and say expecto patronum or whatever, and like and she was healed. Like it was very like low key, non-dramatic, authoritative, and yeah. So which leads me to think about, like, when folks are actually creating these rituals. Like how do you create a ritual out of whole cloth, where you're like, well, the Bible doesn't really give us any guidance here. So we need to create a ritual to make this exorcism work. Like, is there like a structure or some sort of formula that has, presented itself both to Protestant Christians and or Catholics?
Yeah, so if you think about it psychologically, if you think that you're possessed and someone just says, no, Jesus says the demon has to leave, you're better now, right? You're not really going to feel any difference right after that. So people want a little bit of an ordeal, like they want a little bit of a showmanship to really make them feel that this was effective. If you look at the history of Christianity, and if you look more broadly, because most cultures have some tradition of exorcism, pretty much anything that you can think of has been used to cast out demons, including things like holding like burning sulfur and smoke under somebody's nose and like trying to smoke the demon out. Or in Asia, often like cold water will be used. There's actually been some deaths in Asia where someone is basically waterboarded as part of an exorcism ritual, right? And a lot of this seems to be very improvisational, right? So I've seen lots of cases where people have actually killed children, and they said, well, I was trying to exorcise a child. And they said, well, what were you doing? And I said, well, I was shoving this rose covered in holy oil down the child's throat, right? Well, where do they get these ideas, right? So we know in religion, there's basically only three ways to legitimize something, right? You can say it's a revelation, right? God or an angel or somebody appeared to me and said, this is how you do exorcism. It can be tradition, right? So in the Catholic Church, they would say, look, we've had this ritual since 1614. It's authentic. It's the real deal. Or you could say, this is, say, there are Native American traditions that are comparable to exorcism, right? That have a history, right? The third one is reason, right? So the Satanic Temple, they try to justify themselves with an appeal to reason, right? They say, well, we made all this up, but take a look at it and see if it makes sense to you, right? So people are inventing these rituals all the time, and then they're coming up with arguments why it's not really just made up, right? Why this could actually work. Let's see if I can do something about the sunlight here.
Yeah. When you think about like the Satanic Temple, is that tied at all loosely or directly to like the Satanic Panic of like the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, the connection is that, people like Lucian Greaves and Malcolm Jerry are Gen Xers, and they grew up in sort of the shadow of the Satanic Panic. And it's become a way of them sort of expressing their criticism of the system. So Lucian Greaves, when he said that when he first started hearing stories of satanic cults that were abducting children and murdering them in the 80s, he assumed it was real because they were saying it on TV, right? But he did say that it was weird that, people weren't acting like it was real. It's like, if you really believe that there was a satanic cult in your neighborhood that was abducting children, you wouldn't just be watching Geraldo and like shaking your head and clucking your tongue. Like, you would be buying a gun and you would be out, doing all this stuff. And so the more that he researched it, he said, well, this is definitely not real, but Satanism is actually kind of interesting. So in a weird way, the Satanic Panic led to him becoming a Satanist. But a lot of folks in TST I've talked to have said, look, if Christians are so afraid of this, if they're literally going to panic about this, then this is symbolism that I want to adopt for myself. This could be armor that I can use in this political struggle.
Well, was a satanic panic, was that because I think what I know about, I'm a Gen Xer too, wasn't it something that occurred over like in Europe? I don't recall it being an American phenomenon unless I was just not really paying attention.
Yeah, well, so this is something that's happened all throughout history, right? So the Roman pagans said about the early Christians, these guys seem nice, but they have secret rituals where they kill babies and they have orgies, right? And that's what it's been for 2,000 years. Is there's some group of people, it's Jews, it's witches, it's Satanists, and they look like nice people, but they have these weird rituals in secret, and they do weird sex stuff, and they kill babies. It's the same accusation for 2,000 years, because that's the worst thing that people can think of, right? That's the most shocking thing that people can think of. So in Europe, we had the witch hunts, right, which peaked actually coincided with the Protestant Reformation, right, with the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants. Was also the period where everyone was accusing their neighbor of witchcraft. But the modern Satanic Panic really began. It started in the 1970s. It kind of peaked in the 1980s, and then it began to sort of trickle off a little bit in the 1990s. But in the 1980s, we had people who were undergoing hypnosis therapy and believe that their parents had been Satanists who had tortured them. And a lot of this focused on daycares. So people were saying, while you're at work, your daycare provider who's got your kid all day, they're a Satanist and they're torturing your kid. And the torture is so bad the kid can't even remember that it happened, right? And there was this panic. So this led to the McMartin preschool trial, where this family was basically arrested on accusation that they were Satanists and they had hidden tunnels under the preschool where they were torturing children. This is all totally ridiculous. That was at the time the most expensive trial in American history until the O.J. Simpson trial. That finally topped it. But that lasted 7 years. Here in Austin, there was a couple that ran a daycare, and they were in prison for, I think, 20 years before they realized you couldn't possibly have done all these things that you've been accused of. It's just logistically impossible. So it was a real panic. And gradually, there was an FBI report saying that this is not real. These satanic cults do not really exist. And so now judges and law enforcement are sort of more critical of these claims than they were. But I think that QAnon is a direct continuation of the Satanic Panic for the 1980s. It's the same story, right? If they're harvesting adrenochrome, right, and they're doing all these awful things to children. I think the only thing that's changed is it's shifted to the internet. It's shifted from Geraldo and Oprah to Facebook, and now I think that it's been weaponized for political purposes. I think that certain bad actors have realized we can change the outcome of an election if we can just get everybody talking about, Tom Hanks drinks children's blood, or Hillary Clinton goes to a child dungeon underneath a pizza parlor.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because so I don't know, a couple years ago we spoke with Mike Rothschild. No relation to the Rothschilds, but he studies his QAnon stuff backwards and forward, and he was really kind of helping us better understand like why there were people, I don't know, waiting for the return of JFK on a bridge in Texas somewhere. Like, I was like, I don't know, people are crazy, I guess. So yeah, that is kind of interesting. But I'm curious, like how do these like crazy things sort of evolve? I mean, like you, from where I sit, you kind of have these sort of very old religions, Islam and Christianity, all those. I'm not an expert, but those are the two that come to mind. But then like you've got sort of period of time, and then you see like the rise of, witchcraft and Wiccan and, the Satanic Panic. Like does all this stuff just kind of come up to fill a particular, I don't know, like hole in people's like belief system, something they just need to believe to kind of help fill or answer a question? Like can you talk on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think two things are going on. So one is it really does seem to be a staple of Western civilization to come up with these conspiracy theories about people doing the worst things we can imagine. I already mentioned claims about Christianity. Even before Christianity, there were Romans saying, what the cult of Dionysus gets up to? They have these crazy rituals, and they kill babies, and they do weird sex stuff, right? Same claims. And this was used by the Roman government to basically claim more authority to regulate religion, because they said if we don't do this, these cultists will corrupt the empire. So this is basically a fantasy. And I think the reason for this fantasy is, and there's a book about this called Evil Incarnate by David Frankfurter, who's one of my mentors. But if there is a group of people out there who are doing everything that we do, but backwards, right? So we save babies, they eat babies, right? We have sexual relations, however our culture says we ought to have sexual relations. They practice incest and orgies. If our enemies are this sort of backwards nightmare version of us, then we must be the good guys, right? And the way that we do things must be the only way that they could ever be done. So I think people keep making up these stories to sort of reassure themselves that they're on the side of the right. And in a way, these conspiracy theories function to kind of stop people from questioning things, right? Or to put down attempts to sort of reform society. So that's one half of it. The other half of it that you see with the Satanic Temple is there are always people who sort of look at these stories and identify with the underdog, right? So the Satanic Temple identified with the alleged Satanists, right? With Wicca, not all Wiccans may agree with this, but I think that basically there really weren't any witches in early modern Europe. I think that all these people being killed for witchcraft were Christian women, right, who were falsely accused of this. But the sort of legend of, this wise proto-feminist woman who knows the old ways and can heal people with herbs, and she was killed just for that. It's romantic and it's appealing. And so by the 1960s, you had all these people saying, I'm a witch, I'm a Wiccan. And I live in Austin, Texas, and now this city is lousy with witches. I feel like every woman with an Instagram page is a witch suddenly, right? So so we have one group of people sort of making up this awful conspiracy theory for political reasons. Then we have another group of people saying, I want to identify with that kind of shadow figure that you've created.
This might be an odd question, but is any of this at all tied to sort of the, like, I don't want to say belief, but the rise on like aliens, you know, because as you were talking about back in the 80s, like I do remember, I mean, there are all these programs that I can't believe I was allowed to watch where it's like you would have people be hypnotized to talk about their like probing when they were abducted, you know, and that was the proof that aliens are real, because like how could they make this stuff up while they're hypnotized? So like is there a tie at all there?
Yeah, there absolutely is, right? So, you know, I used to teach high school honors psychology, for whatever that's worth, right? And most psychologists have said, well, hypnosis isn't real. Like nothing's happening in your brain when you're hypnotized. It is a social interaction and you're playing a role, right? So just like you act differently at work than when you're at your favorite dive bar, when you're being hypnotized, you're playing the role of a hypnotic subject and you act differently and you think differently because of that social dynamic. But that's all it really is. It's a social dynamic between you and the hypnotist, right? And so hypnotism got really big in the 1980s. So at the same time that you might go to a hypnotherapist and you conjure these memories of your parents being Satanists, you go to a different hypnotist and you could remember being abducted by aliens. So there were lots of people who said, you know, I have weird ideas about aliens and I found like this bump on my hand and I don't know what it is, or I found a scoop mark. I think I might have been abducted by aliens. And then you go to the right hypnotist and sure enough, you remember being abducted by aliens. And in both of these cases, there is a lot of guiding and sort of leading questions by the hypnotist. So if you look at the satanic ritual abuse cases, the hypnotist is asking questions like, were there any black candles there? You know, and they're like, well, yeah, there are actually. I can see them in my mind, right? And this recent Netflix documentary came out called A Manhattan Abduction, and they look at this hypnotist named John Mack, who was one of the leading figures in the 80s. But there are tapes of him leading people through a therapy to remember being abducted by aliens, and you can see he's asking very leading questions. And then when they say stuff that he doesn't like or that's sort of too weird, he would kind of just toss that out, right? He'd be like, well, that's probably just your imagination. The aliens didn't do that, but let's go back to what the aliens did do, right? So yeah, these both come out of similar notions of sort of, in my opinion, flawed theories about how memories work. And they also, I actually even wrote an article about this, but it's really odd that in satanic ritual abuse and alien abduction cases, and also witch trials from the 1600s, 1500s, there's all this bizarre sexual stuff, right? It's always these things came and then they put things in my butt for reasons that nobody knows, right? There's never any reason for it, but they're always doing this. And I think part of it is, this is how you know that this really happens, right? On some sort of gut level, where like things aren't really real unless they come and, you know, basically sexually penetrate you. And then, you know, who could have made this up? But this happens again and again and again. I find that a very strange pattern.
It's so wild. Yeah. For some reason, like just images of South Park are just like going through my head as you were you were talking, which
and I do want to be clear. I have met abductees. I've met Whitley Strieber, who wrote the book Communion, and so forth. And I should just be clear, whatever happened to Whitley Strieber, it was genuinely traumatic, right? These experiences are real for them. So I know that when Whitley Strieber watched the kind of South Park thing where sort of a satellite is coming out of Cartman's butt or something like that, right? I think he actually said at one point, you know, I really wish I had never used the word anal probe to describe my memories of abduction. So, I mean, it's hard not to kind of giggle about this stuff, but it is good to remember it's real for the people who sort of recovered these memories or had these experiences.
Yeah. So this is my last question for you, and I'm curious. Like, you've been in this field profession for a while. You've studied, read books, seen stuff. Like, is there anything in your experience that leads you to believe that any of the stuff that we've talked about, you know, maybe some of the myths or theology or, you know, whatever, could potentially be real? or and if the answer is a strict no, then like what would be the one thing that like you hope was real? Like for me, I'll answer, I wish aliens were real. Like
that I hope. Yeah, I mean, gosh. Yeah, I mean, of course, I would love to have kind of certainty that there is this sort of omnipotent, benevolent deity that sort of is going to make everything come out okay, and maybe in the very long run that's true, right? But things are not coming out okay right now in the way that I, as a human, would like them to come out okay, right? So if there's a
yeah,
plan, it's not a plan that's sort of known to me. Basically, when I teach my students, I try to just kind of teach them to be modest about what we can really know, right? So if somebody says I'm possessed by a demon, we should definitely look at skeptical interpretations of what's going on with them. But as far as categorically, do demons exist or not exist? I don't really think we can know the answer to that. And I also think it's possible to be skeptical in a way that's incredibly lazy, right? So one example I go to is in Fatima, Portugal in 1917, there was a reported miracle where the sun appeared to sort of spin and change colors, and it dive bomb an audience of thousands and thousands of people. And historians are just sort of like, well, that's a weird thing. Like we don't we don't know what that was, right? And we don't know what it was. And the UFO people, of course, are all over it. And when I try to point out why this is a problem for historians, my students say stuff like, well, they're probably on drugs, right? So like a whole village in Portugal is suddenly on drugs and doesn't know it. And I mean, Woodstock, everybody was on drugs. Nothing like that happened at Woodstock, right? So this seems very lazy to me, right? This seems like we're not actually sitting with how weird these things are. And I think the universe is actually a very weirder place than either religion or science acknowledges. The only person in religious studies who's actually really trying to take these kinds of things more seriously and get to the bottom of them is a guy named Jeffrey Kripal at Rice University. He'd be a great guest for you to have sometime. But typically in religious studies, when they take these reports, they just kind of avoid the question of what actually happened to these people and focus instead on kind of, well, what was its sort of significance to the person who experienced it, or how did this sort of change people's attitudes about their religion or whatever. But as far as what's actually happening in a lot of these cases, I honestly have no idea. Some of them really boggle the mind.
wow. So what are you working on next, and how can people follow the work that you're doing?
Sure. I'm currently trying to pitch a book on lizard people. I've been getting to the bottom of the lizard
Yes.
people conspiracy theory, which is much older than people realize, right? It's almost about 100 years old, but it's really picked up a lot in the last few years. I also have a book coming out next year called The Penguin Book of Cults, which is going to be a book of readings from different groups that are called cults, not just from the 20th century, but all the way back kind of through history. My books are on Amazon. You can just type in Joseph Laycock on Amazon, or you can just Google Joseph Laycock, and you'll probably find my website right away.
That's awesome. So just follow-up question: lizard people like slee stacks, like from those type of people?
Well, there are a lot of people who believe that the government is run by reptile aliens who can shapeshift and look like human beings, right? I had an Uber driver in
From
LA
like the
this
TV
weekend
show, right?
who
V?
believed that.
Mm.
Yeah, there was a TV show V, which is a big influence on this, but this idea really goes all the way back to a story by Robert E. Howard, who created Conan the Barbarian. And in 1929, he has a story about these shape-shifting serpent men who have taken over the kingdom. And I'm tracing how it went from that story to kind of weird occult groups in the 30s and 40s, to pop culture, to actually a lot of very racist churches saying things about, Eve had sex with the serpent and things like that. And then finally to figures like David Icke and these kinds of anti-Semitic forms that this has taken. So it's very silly on the face of it, but actually I think it's very dangerous to have an ideology that says some people aren't really people, right? When has anything good ever come out of that? So I don't know when I'm going to get a publisher to buy in on this book, But hopefully, at some point in the near future, you can get a really detailed history of the lizard people conspiracy theory. But yeah, Slee Stacks are a part of it. Slee Stacks and V, and at one point even Barney the dinosaur gets worked into this conspiracy theory. So yeah, it's a wild ride.
Yeah, V was a crazy TV show. I mean, I mean, even like the remake that they did. I mean, like I'm a big sci-fi buff, so like that sounds frightening, and I will definitely keep an eye out for that book. And yeah, good luck to you. Well, thanks a lot for everything, Joseph. This has been super great. Learned a ton. My co-host is going to be bummed that he wasn't able to sit in on this because now I got to play the smart theologian on him on text once we're all done here. But thank you so much. Good luck with everything that you're doing. And yeah, to our listeners and audience, yeah, thanks for stopping by. And remember, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.